in 1843, Marx wrote his book on the Jewish question. And when he wrote that, Germany was ruled by decrepit aristocrats who proclaimed that they ruled on behalf of the Christian religion. The so-called spirit of the state was Christian. So they had all sorts of laws oppressing Jews. So it was an apartheid state. That was, all these little princelings were running apartheid states. Now, Marx's book was written in response to another book. It was written by a bloke called Bruno Bauer. And Bruno Bauer, at that point, was a revolutionary. And Marx debated very sharply with him, because Bauer had said in his book that if Jews wanted emancipation, they should first give up their religion. He said that a state can only be secular if everybody is induced to give up their religion. Now, within a couple of years, Bauer moved from radical politics to straight-out anti-Semitism. Now, nowadays, the Zionist state of Israel declares that the spirit of its state is Jewish, which is just a mirror image of the oppressive German apartheid states of that time, the kind of state that Marx denounced. Now, the logic of Zionism leads directly to the kind of racist hatred that came to possess Bruno Bauer. Bruno Bauer grew to hate Jews, and Zionists are possessed by a genocidal hatred of Palestinians. So what Marx argued for was a democratic secular state in which people could express their humanity, including all of its religious and spiritual aspects. So when we call for a democratic secular Palestine, that's something that Red Ant does call for, by the way, that's what we're talking about. That's the content of "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." So today I want to examine how we got into this whole mess of anti-Semitism and Zionism. How did anti-Semitism arise in the first place? What has maintained it over the years? And how did it get intertwined with capitalism? And I say that Zionism actually maintains anti-Semitism. So I'm going to cover 2,000 years of history in approximately 30 minutes, which is about 1.5 minutes per century. So I will be skimming over things. And I'm going to be arguing that anti-Semitism, just like BJ was saying, is a problem of European civilization. It's not a problem of religion, and it's been dumped onto the Palestinian people. And I say that Zionism is a false messiah for the Jewish people, creating disaster. I'm drawing on a variety of sources for this, including a couple of Marx's books, Karl Kautsky's Foundations of Christianity, Abraham Leon's classic work, The Jewish State, Perry Anderson's Passages from Antiquity to Feudalism, The Darkening Age by Catherine Nixie. I recommend all of these readings. And Janie Stone and Donnie Kluckstein's recent and excellent book on the radical Jewish tradition. And there are 10 copies of that here for people to buy if you want to buy one. It's just come out. So let's start with what the Mediterranean world was like 2,000 years ago. The dominant force was the Roman Empire, which Kautsky explains was built on the military prowess of the independent Italian farmers. They were organized into legions and they conquered the world. They were the yeoman farmers. However, the empire's expansion created contradictions that eventually tore it apart. And it was because the military victories brought an endless supply of slaves into Italy. As the slave economy grew, it undermined the economic position of the yeoman farmers and drove them into the cities as proletarians. And slave production itself had its own contradictions that also undermined it. So the urban proletarians had citizenship rights and they demanded bread from the rulers. So the metropolis, Rome, uselessly sucked in resources from the rest of the empire. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels say that the intractable class struggle between the rich and the poor in Rome mutually exhausted both sides and the whole edifice just collapsed. So having undermined the economy of the yeoman farmers, to raise armies, Rome turned to mercenaries like the German Vandals and Goths. They trained these tribes in military technique. And eventually those mercenaries simply just invaded and took over. As Abraham Leon explains, the Jewish people in the Middle East were perfectly placed to succeed as traders because they bridged the Roman, Egyptian, Babylonian, and Chinese empires. So Jews were scattered in the diaspora as traders long before the Jewish revolt and the destruction of Jerusalem. And I'll just give a short description of these Jewish traders. This comes from a Muslim writer, actually, a couple of centuries later, but he said the merchants speak Arabic, Persian, Greek, the language of the Franks, of the Andalusians, and of the Slavs. They journey from west to east and from east to west, partly on land, partly by sea. They take ship in the land of the Franks on the western sea and steer for Egypt. There they load their goods on the backs of camels and travel by land to Kulzum. There they embark into the eastern sea and go to India and China. So the bottom line of all of this is that these people were extremely sophisticated. The Jewish religion was centered in Jerusalem, where the priests dominated and lived corruptly. But in the diaspora, the Jewish sect called the Pharisees built community prayer centers called synagogues, and their theology actually opposed the priesthood. These synagogues were sophisticated and intellectually rich and attracted a large supporter base of non-Jews who were allowed to participate on the fringe of the congregations. And among those fringe groups, who are made up of Greeks, the Jewish food restrictions and circumcision were quite abhorrent. So while there was a large community of non-Jewish sympathizers, there was a barrier to them converting. But then into the synagogues came a new Jewish sect, the Christians. And to put it mildly, they sparked debate. They said Jesus was the Messiah and God had allowed them to eat whatever they wanted, and men did not have to get circumcised. Now, at the beginning of each synagogue meeting, the Pharisees would call down blessings from God on the congregation, and then they'd call down curses on the enemies of the congregation. After a while, the Christians got added to the list of people being cursed. And that drove them out of the synagogues. And it led the Christians, as they wrote their Gospels, transposing back into the mouth of Jesus the debates that they were having with the other Jewish groups. Abraham Leon says there was also a class divide in all this. He says, and this is a quote, Christianity in its beginnings must be considered as a reaction of the labouring masses of the Jewish people against the domination of the wealthy commercial classes. Now, all of this squabbling among Jewish sects wouldn't mean anything except that in the year 312, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity. So out went Christian radicalism, in came Christian dominion. Christianity blessed the emperor, and the emperor used Christianity as a tool. Perry Anderson says that the rise of Christianity was both a symptom and a cause of the collapse of the Roman Empire. The Christian hierarchy that started being paid by the Roman state added yet another layer of useless bureaucracy to an already bloated state apparatus. But by effectively becoming the police, the Christians brought a whole new ideology to Western civilization, and that is total ignorance. As Catherine Nixie explains, the early church fathers preached and recommended that the masses should remain totally illiterate, and they organised the destruction of libraries and much more. For example, St. Augustine said, all superstition of pagans and heathens should be annihilated. That is what God wants, God commands, God proclaims. So all the statues, all the temples, all the books were attacked, especially books. Christine Nixie estimates that 90% of antique literature went up in flames. All the libraries, the whole lot, and librarians copped it in the neck, literally with swords. So while all of this burning and wrecking was going on, the Goths and the Visigoths invaded. Perry Anderson says that their arrival melded the dying slave economy with Germanic social structures and created feudalism. But both parts of that synthesis were in crisis when they met. So the result was very slow in maturing. That this is what we call the Dark Ages. Under feudalism, the productive working masses, the peasants, were tied to the land and forbidden to travel. There was a social contract. The peasants fed the barons protected the peasants. Nothing was meant to change. God was in his heaven, and on earth, everything was in its place. The prevailing ideology was stasis, and that was blessed by the church. Part of the theology was that usury, lending money for interest, was bad and wrong, because that actually created economic growth. The only proper source of wealth was land, so the barons and kings incessantly warred against each other to expand their holdings. However, what about the Jews? So they not only had another religion, they had books, and they read, and they argued, and they moved around the place trading, and they were very sophisticated. The economy of feudalism was natural and survivalist. Abraham Leon says it produced values, it used values, not exchange values. That is, each village or valley met its own needs. But there was still a need for trade, especially in luxuries. So just as the Dalits, the untouchables in India, got consigned to doing all the socially necessary labour that was outside of the social construct, but everybody condemns them for it, Jews were consigned to a similarly tight niche in European civilization. Jews were allowed to trade, and through that they acquired hordes of money. And when the barons and kings needed cash for their armies, they borrowed from the Jews. When it came time to pay back, they would often denounce those Jews as usurers, kill them, and seize their wealth. And for good measure, they might unleash a pogrom from among the peasantry as well. So from this, you can see how anti-Semitism was constructed and how useful it was for the ruling orders. Janie Stone and Donnie Kluckstein explain how, as capitalism began to slowly crystallize within feudalism, kings would sometimes expel Jews from their realms to stop competition with Christian capitalists. Now, one of the nations that was actually accepting of Jews was Poland. And so most Jews ended up living there. Then Poland got carved up between various empires, and the majority of Jews ended up living under the Russian Tsars. The Tsars strictly constrained Jews to a limited number of occupations and living locations. It essentially trapped them as a middle layer between the sainted Tsar and the peasants. Now, I'll just read a description here of life in the Polish town of Vilna that illustrates how the Tsars set up their realm so that everybody hated each other and had to relate to the Tsar as like the holy arbitrator. So this is the description. Despite several communities living cheek by jowl, there was no melting pot. Each nationality lived a separate life and had no contact with the other. 8 different languages were spoken. Polish stood at 31%, Russian 20%, while Belarusian and Lithuanian were among the others. But Yiddish was easily highest at 40%. These proportions were reversed outside the city precincts. Yiddish speakers were 4%, whereas Russian constituted 44%, Ukrainian 18%, and so on. So it was like the Tsarist society was set up like a pressure cooker, with the peasantry having an enormous number of resentments. But the people they were directed to resenting were these Jewish traders in the towns. So within this ghettoized existence, there were also class differentiations between rich Jews who liaised with outside authorities and poorer Jews. And this is a recurrent feature all the way up to the Zionist behaviour in World War II. Now, Janie Stone and Donnie Kluckstein show that where the bourgeoisie took up its historical role of waging democratic revolution against feudalism, Jewish emancipation advanced. Revolutions were good for Jews. Those capitalist revolutions occurred because capitalism is based on commodity production for profit, not use values. So money hoards, which the traders had, changed into capital, and capital needs freedom to chase profit. And workers need freedom to sell their labor power. So the human beings who personify both capital and labor power need freedom, and that gives us bourgeois democracy. Where the bourgeoisie chickened out of its revolutionary role, especially in Germany and in Tsarist Russia, Jews suffered. Now, so revolutions were good for Jews, counter-revolutions were bad. And today Zionism is clearly a counter-revolutionary force. Within Tsarist Russia, Jews suffered as capitalism emerged because, as Isaac Deutscher pointed out, they were, quote, the main primitive agent of the money economy. And as the incoming capitalist money economy smashed feudal life, those on the receiving end struck out blindly at what they experienced as the cause. From all of this, Jews in the lower classes drew revolutionary conclusions and became leaders of revolutionary movements. And that tradition extended into the rise of the revolutionary communist movement. Many of the leaders of the Bolshevik Party were Jews. So Janie Stone and Donnie Kluckstein say that many Jews became communists or members of the Bund, which was a politically centrist organization, a socialist organization. The Bund organized armed resistance to pogroms within the Tsarist Empire, some of which had very significant successes. So Jews were not like passive victims of anti-Semitism. The socialist Jews led resistance to that. But there were other political trends within the Jewish community that did not organize resistance. For example, the conservative rabbis wanted to control the population, and they would do anything possible to not upset anti-Semitic authorities. And those Orthodox conservatives opposed any idea of moving to Palestine and establishing a Jewish state. They said that could only happen after the Messiah comes. So this actually gives the lie to the Zionist claim that establishing Israel fulfilled centuries of prophecy. In fact, the creation of Israel broke with centuries of religious teaching. Another competing trend was bourgeois assimilationism. Rich Jews found it convenient to simply adopt the prevailing language and culture. Assimilationism was strongest where emancipation was best established, which was in Western Europe. Assimilationist Jews came to see their lower class co-religious as an embarrassment. Assimilationists adjusted themselves to the prevailing racism of their capitalist societies. So, for example, the British Board of Deputies did not oppose the 1905 Aliens Act, which was designed explicitly to exclude Jews from entering Britain. The last trend was Zionism, which was established by Theodor Herzl, and it had the least support of all of the political trends within the community, the Jewish community. Isaac Deutscher noted, and Isaac Deutscher actually was in Poland during a lot of these debates. He noted that the Jewish community elections that were held regularly in Poland up to World War II, in those elections, the Zionists never once won a majority. The overwhelming majority voted for the Bund or for communists. But what Zionism lacked in grassroots support, it made up for in networks with the great and the powerful. Theodor Herzl made it his business to reach out to the most anti-Semitic political figures and offer them the service of extracting Jews from their societies. Herzl described all progressive thinking, he despised all progressive thinking. He said, this is a quote, "Universal brotherhood is not even a beautiful dream." Now, following his death, his followers reached out to the anti-Semite Lord Arthur Balfour, the man who was responsible for the 1905 Aliens Act, And he declared British support for the Zionist homeland in Palestine. Now, there are a couple of reasons for Balfour's declaration. One reason was, as he put it, this is a quote from a letter he wrote, it was to mitigate the age-long miseries created for Western civilization by the presence in its midst of a body which it too long regarded as alien and even hostile, but which it was equally unable to expel or to absorb. I mean, could you get a better mouthful of anti-Semitism than that? Stone and Kluckstein say that the Balfour Declaration was also, they say, a cynical decision of an embattled imperialism desperate for allies. Balfour was hoping that the Zionists in the USA would push the USA into World War I. Now, Britain double-crossed everyone. Besides the 1916 Balfour Declaration, they offered Palestine to the Arabs in 1915 and as a joint administration to the French in 1916. In a letter to the British Prime Minister, Balfour said, "The weak point of our position, of course, is that in the case of Palestine, we deliberately and rightly decline to accept the principle of self-determination. We do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country, the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land." Now, in 1917, there was another event, the Russian Revolution. That revolution swept away all anti-Semitic laws in Russia. Within a few weeks, the revolution achieved more than what the Zionists and other trends and other conservatives had ever achieved anywhere. It gave the total lie to the Zionist claim that non-Jews will always hate and oppress Jews. Now, I won't go into the rest of the history of the Russian Revolution. There's a lot to be said. And I won't go into the history of Zionist expansion into Palestine either. But what is important is the relationship between the bourgeois Zionists and imperialism and how willing the Zionists were to betray their co-religious. Now, as is well known, in the 1920s, Germany was gripped by a series of revolutionary waves and the growth of a mass communist party. The German bourgeoisie found it convenient to unleash the Nazis onto the leftists. Nazi propaganda always identified communists as Judeo-Bolsheviks. They also channeled mass discontent with capitalism into hatred of Jewish capitalists. So the German bourgeoisie happily threw their Jewish comrades to the wolves. But there was a lot of throwing people to the wolves going on. An example of what occurred immediately, an example of that throwing people to the wolves occurred immediately after Hitler took power. There was a worldwide boycott of German goods. There was a kind of like a BDS, like we have today. A slogan of that boycott was, "The boycott is the moral substitute for war." But the World Zionist Organization deliberately undermined the boycott by cutting a deal with the Nazis. It was called the Transfer Agreement. It allowed 60,000 Jews to move to Palestine as part of the Zionist project. They had to buy their way out of Germany, so poor and left-wing Jews were sacrificed. Now, ironically, as Nathaniel Flaken relates in his biography of the immortal Jewish communist resistance fighter, Martin Monath, the agreement allowed Zionist organizations to actually function legally in Nazi Germany all the way up to Kristallnacht in 1938, while leaving left-wing organizations to be smashed. So Yiddish language newspapers were imported legally from Poland, and the Nazi authorities couldn't read that. So the police would visit Zionist meetings and not notice that Martin Monath, the communist, was reading the writings of Leon Trotsky in Yiddish to the youth. Now, Monath went on to a heroic career operating underground in occupied France. He produced a German language newspaper directed at German soldiers, and he recruited many. If you look into the history of that, it is an amazing history and truly inspiring. Unfortunately, now he was martyred by the SS just before the liberation of Paris. Now, the Zionists cannot point to similar heroes because their record was horribly different. Perhaps the worst example of collaboration was that of rounding up and extermination of the Hungarian Jews in 1944. At that point, the war was clearly coming to an end, but the Nazis were still intent on their genocide. Hitler's favourite henchman, Adolf Eichmann, was in charge of Hungary, and he had an underling called Kurt Becher, who was organising the shipping out of Jews. Now, Becher had honed his skills on the Eastern Front, where he slaughtered Jews with machine guns and special mobile gas trucks. Now, his first job in Hungary was to shake down Jewish capitalists for money. He was known to have suitcases full of loot. Now, given the balance of forces in the war, how could he get the Jewish community onto transport trains without sparking a revolt? He worked with the leader of the Hungarian Zionists, a guy called Retzo Kaczner. Becher allowed Kaczner to organize around 1,700 bourgeois Jews to leave Hungary by train and go to Palestine in return for copious bribes. Kaczner knew very well about the gas chambers. He enjoyed night clubbing with the Nazi occupiers. He was eating and drinking the best while other Jews starved. He was a total collaborator. Now, Kaczner's role was to run around Hungary telling ordinary Jews that it was safe to get on the Nazi trains. He said they were going to work in factories. But on his train, there were wealthy Jews, Zionist leaders, prominent rabbis, and Kaczner's friends and family. He even organised for the Nazis to go along his train and carefully vet who was on there. And a couple of people who'd snuck on, who weren't on the list, a couple of Jews trying to escape, no, they were physically thrown off the train. So the Nazi leader, Becher, was able to peacefully vacuum up about 700,000 Hungarian Jews in a matter of weeks. The vast number of transported Hungarian Jews overwhelmed the capacity of the gas chambers. Now, Art Spiegelman, in his graphic memoir, Mouse, A Survivor's Tale, recounts his Polish father telling him what happened next. His father was in Auschwitz. Those that finished in the gas chambers before they got pushed in those graves, it was the lucky ones. The others had to jump in the graves while they were still alive. Prisoners what worked there poured gasoline over the live ones and the dead ones, and the fat from the burning bodies they scooped and poured again so everyone could burn better. Okay, Becher, he was tried for war crimes at Nuremberg, but he got off scot-free. That was because Retzo Kaczner rushed to Nuremberg to defend him. Kaczner told the court, Becher belongs to this is a quote, Becher belongs to the very few SS leaders having the courage to oppose the program of annihilation of the Jews and trying to rescue human lives. Becher went on after the war to become a successful businessman in West Germany. And he even advised Chancellor Kohl. It appears that he used his stash of looted wealth as his grub stake for setting up his business. What happened to Kaczner afterwards demonstrates Zionism's absolute viciousness and hypocrisy, because in the 1950s in Israel, he became the spokesperson for the Israeli Ministry of Trade. However, one of the Hungarian Jews who he had betrayed, who had managed to survive, denounced him publicly as a collaborator. And the Israeli government sued that person for defamation on behalf of Katzner, right? So this is the Zionist state suing, taking a death camp survivor to court in defense of a collaborator. In his defense, Kastner said that betraying the Hungarian Jews was acceptable because they had assimilated into Hungarian culture. They weren't talking Yiddish, they weren't talking Hebrew, they were talking Hungarian. He said, quote, "The Hungarian Jew was a branch of Judaism which long ago dried up on the tree." So he meant that because Hungarian Jews were assimilated, they could not be expected to resist and they were not worthy to be saved. And okay, in the first court hearing, he was found guilty. However, the Israeli Supreme Court on appeal said that, yes, he was guilty of collaboration with the Nazis, but they overturned the part of the victory, the verdict, that found that sending Hungarian Jews to their deaths was wrong. Now, the point of all this, I say, is that Israel is not a safe haven for Jews. It's only a safe haven for Zionists. From Retzo Katzner's train to the Israeli helicopters who slaughtered Israeli citizens on October the 7th, Zionism is utterly cynical. So in conclusion, comrades, I want to reiterate that Zionism is a false messiah for the Jewish people. And that expression I take from the title of Nathan Weinstock's very good history of Zionism. It's called Zionism False Messiah. But my last words I'll take from Abram Leon, and I'll interpose my thoughts in what he wrote. Now, remember that he wrote this under German occupation at the very worst point of World War II, when the Nazis were inflicting anti-Semitism on all of Europe. He was a leader of the Belgian communist resistance to the Nazis, and he died in one of the Nazi death camps as well. So Abram Leon said, "Never has the situation of the Jews been so tragic." Now, I say the situation of the Palestinians today is tragic, but so is the situation of the Jews caught in the false consciousness of Zionism. I say it leads to madness. Abram Leon: "In the worst periods of the Middle Ages, entire countries opened their doors to receive them. Today, capitalism, which rules the world, makes the earth uninhabitable for them." That applies to the Palestinians today. There are 5 million stateless Palestinians in the world today. Abram Leon: "Never has the mirage of a promised land so haunted the Jewish people, but never was a promised land less capable of resolving the Jewish question than in our time." And I say that that is as equally true today as it was when Abram Leon wrote it back in the 1940s. Thank you.